Now let's talk more about COVID-19 related matters. Business organization Sakeliga is threatening legal action over COVID-19 regulations. It's given the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, and the Health Minister, Dr. Joe Phaahla, an ultimatum. You withdraw the rules or we'll drag you to court. Applications have already been brought by Afriforum and Solidarity. For more on this, we're joined by Sakeliga's Pete Leroux. A very good morning to you, Pete, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure you would have heard all those numbers, the latest COVID-19 numbers we've given, and I'm sure you would have also heard the mention by health professionals that we are nearing our entrance into a fifth wave. So why would you want regulations to be scrapped?
We've had 2 years of severe harm to the economy and to the lives of people all over the world. And it's important now, 2 years since we've initially predicted an apocalypse, to realize that things have changed. We've learned a lot. And as Professor Shaba Mahdi and many others are pointing out, 80% plus of people in this country and the world over probably have, and this is what the tests show, some form of previous exposure already. So this it is expected for many years to come, as far as is currently known, that there will be from time to time high numbers of cases. But the reason why we had these measures and lockdown measures were never to prevent, at least initially, it was never to prevent the spread of this. Initially, it was understood quite well that these forms of disease are not eradicable with our current understanding of medical technology and science, and therefore we have to live with it. And now, years into into us learning as a society about this phenomenon, these viruses that have caused these COVID-19, we should understand that it will be with us for at least a long while to come. And it's not the same as it was 2 years ago when we didn't know much. We need to continue with our lives. More than 1 million people, in fact, close to 2 million people in South Africa are unemployed since lockdown 2 years ago. If we don't turn this around, we are steering into all forms of social crisis, coupled with everything else we see right now. It's important to restore normality. These measures cannot stop the virus. It cannot be eradicated. Therefore, they are not reasonable.
Pete, is going to court perhaps not a little drastic? Wouldn't you want to first sit down with the head of state and the health minister to find common ground?
Yes, we've all through these 2 years, we've always sought first to have some discussions. It's problematic, though, when the president or others publish at late at night regulations that a few hours later turn things around and the whole country should know about them, and otherwise you can face 10 years in jail, such as we see now. But we, again, this time extended an invitation to the president and to Minister Phaahla to meet and to discuss this first. But we said we can only give you until 18 May, and by then we have not discussed this and come to some other kind of solution. We will go to court, and as before, we've won against some of these regulations. We will again go to court. We think Afriforum and Solidarity's applications are strong as well. But from a business side, it's important to not drive a wedge between business and the rest of society and make businesses and churches and schools and so on enforcers of state policy.
Businesses have always challenged and encouraged government to not make decisions that are not based on science. So if you're going to be going to court on the 19th of May, because the ultimatum, at least the deadline is until the 18th, if you're going to be going to court on the 19th of May, I would imagine that you as Sakeliga, Afriforum and Solidarity are going in there with science-backed case.
Well, these organizations, Afriforum and Solidarity, we've had a look at some of their papers. It's in the public domain. But each of those organizations bring the litigation in their own right and with their own arguments. Litigation is can be a very technical thing, and it depends on what you're asking, what you're trying to prove. So there are many ways in which these regulations are unacceptable. For one, the minister never complied with the prescribed 3 months consultation period, and that alone on procedural grounds is calls for review. But Sakeliga will certainly consider to go as well. Because we'd like to, not only for those and several others already advanced, point out to what we've learned so far and why some of these regulations are irrational. For example, the distinction between vaccinated and unvaccinated people and the restrictions and the mandates placed on organizations, businesses, churches to distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated people or boosted and unboosted. It's all a bit of a jumble at the moment. But we are now expected as businesses, as churches, as schools, to limit our gatherings by monitoring people's vaccine status. But now, in this stage, we know, and we will probably seek to advise the court that the vaccines, as much as they may benefit or not individual cases, we are not recommending anything because we're not a medical organization. But it is clear that from a social perspective, they are not preventing transmission. They are not preventing several other things on which this distinction is currently based. There are also the border restrictions that differ between citizens and non-citizens. And so we will ask the court that it's important to return to normality, and these regulations are not based on reasonable and constitutionally acceptable grounds.
Just before I let you go, Pete, we've heard the main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, also just wanting to take government to court over the same situation. You as Sakeliga are not going in there with Afriforum and Solidarity. Do you think you have a strong case, a case strong enough to make government really change and scrap these regulations?
Well, we think so. Fortunately, we don't have to convince government or Mr. Pasha or President Ramaphosa. We only have to convince the court. I think we have a very strong legal case on this. And I think it's important to stress that as much as some scientists would want some of these regulations, the overwhelming, in our view, position from scientists today is different. But even if that was not the case, this is not simply a matter of science. This is also a matter of public policy. And as such, whether you are credentialized as a scientist or not, all of us should be concerned with these regulations because they introduce a new supposed normal with extensive powers in the hands of bureaucrats that are unaccountable. And this did not go through Parliament. This is in strict violation, strong violation of constitutional principles. We are heading toward a system where, by promulgation, important lines will be drawn in the sand. We will be told who we can allow in the home or not, how many people we can allow, what we can buy and what we cannot buy. These are the principles contained in the regulations currently promulgated. And as a society, we should stand together against these regulations because they centralize everything in central government authority instead of allowing for a distributed approach and different spheres of society to be strong, such as is required of a vibrant civil society. This is a social question, not only a scientific question.
I've got one more question for you, just very briefly, if you can respond for me, Pete. If government then comes to Sakeliga tomorrow, the 16th of May, and say to you, we've heard you, but we can't completely scrap the regulations. What we are prepared to do is perhaps tweak them, reduce them, mold, alter them to a point where it almost seems as though there are no more regulations, but there are certain regulations that encourage South Africans to be aware that we are still in a pandemic.
We would say to President Ramaphosa that leadership does not come through regulation, but through recommendations. And whatever they propose, we will look at. It has to be legal. We think none of these regulations are legal, and the principles on which they are based, the statutes under which they are promulgated, do not allow them. Therefore, it's unlikely that we will accept a change to the regulations, because if they are material, then there should be no regulations. If they're immaterial, then it's not acceptable. So leadership comes through recommendation. That's the point where we are now, not through regulation and prescription.
Pete, thank you so much for joining us here on the South African Morning. That is Sakeliga's Pete Leroux, and they are saying, President, Minister, scrap these regulations, or on the 19th of May, we are going to court. Of course, that is where we're going to be leaving it for now.